Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session on building management and compulsory sale orders in Europe. My name is David Jordan, and I'm a full-time doctoral scholarship student and lecturer at Munster Technological University. We're thrilled to be joined today by an amazing and diverse panel of speakers from Ireland, Scotland, and Denmark. We were so inspired when organizing this event to get to know each one of the speakers, and each one of them have their own unique perspectives and experience on dealing with dereliction and vacancy in towns, which we are so looking forward to sharing with you all today. So before we start, just a couple of housekeeping points. Firstly, a recorded version of this webinar will be available, and a link will be provided to everyone after the session by Brian Han from Event Comms, who is here today acting as a support, but more importantly, keeping the speakers and myself on track with timings. As you probably noticed, everyone's on mute throughout the webinar, but we really would love to hear from you, and we encourage you to post questions in the Q&A section. We also have a chat box if you want to make any comments on the content throughout the webinar, so please do. Each speaker will present for 10 minutes, and afterwards we will have a 5-minute Q&A session. So please do keep the questions coming, and I will do my absolute best to get through as many as possible. For all those social media enthusiasts, we will be using the hashtag CSO Matters throughout the event, so please do ensure to use it. So before we start with our first presenter, I would like to introduce you to the organizer of this event, who'll be basically Ali Harvey, who's going to be saying a brief few words on the importance of this webinar. Over to you, Ali.
Thanks, David. Okay, welcome everyone to this first webinar on compulsory sale orders in Europe. Just want to say on behalf of the team that we're just blown away by the numbers of people who have signed up. I think we're at 360, so it's just amazing, the interest in this topic. As we all know, people have reconnected with their localities and place during lockdown. And this webinar aims to tap into and harness this growing public awareness and the need for a strong sense of place and belonging. Today's webinar is part of the Heritage Council's Collaborative Town Centre Health Check programme, which is included in the programme for government. We have lots of brilliant speakers, and I would like to thank them all for their time. Also, thanks to David and Brian for all their hard work in putting together this webinar. So thank you. Back to David.
Thanks, Ali. So now to introduce our first speakers, Jude Cherry and Dr. Frank O'Connor are the latest people to raise their arms on the issue of derelict and vacant sites in our towns and cities. Jude and Frank are directors of the global agency Anish, set up to create value through systems designed for sustainability, responsibility, equality, and social justice. Jude and Frank have gathered lots of media attention when they started sharing images of derelict properties online, and are here to introduce us to what they believe is the current status of dereliction in our towns in Ireland. Over to you guys, Jude and Frank. Thank you.
Thanks, David.
Thank you, David. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited to speak here. Thanks so much for the invitation, and thanks for the wonderful introduction as well. Yeah, we're Jude and Frank. We're system designers, and for those who don't know, Anish means now in Irish. We've over 50 years combined experience working in sustainability projects all over the world, and working with governments and policy and with businesses on strategy. And we focus on resources on a product and urban level. Our work encompasses a wide range of fields, disciplines and sectors, and is backed by international best practice. Late 2018, we moved to Cork City from Amsterdam. We've been away from Ireland for a few decades, and neither of us are originally from Cork City. We were immediately struck by the friendliness of the Corkonians and the beauty and uniqueness of the built environmental landscape. However, we were also taken aback by the decay, dereliction, the high levels of homelessness, the housing crisis, and the lack of care towards the city's wonderful heritage. How could this be the way in one of the richest countries in the world? It started to get us down. We knew we needed to do something about it. So on the first day we officially moved into our new home in Cork City, we started to immerse ourselves in the environment and record what we were experiencing. Through photographs, conversation notes, maps, sketches and other means. And in June last year, we started sharing our findings on Twitter. In particular, we started sharing this thread of derelict properties, all within 2 kilometres of the city centre Ireland, influenced by the livable 15-minute city and the COVID restrictions. Apologies if it makes you feel a bit nausea watching it. It does go on and on. So far, it's 11 months of a daily dose of dereliction. So why do we do this? As well as being system designers, we also consider ourselves to be urban explorers. We've walked and documented many urban environments. In doing so, we shine a light, challenge the way things are, highlight potential, and provide alternatives and solutions. In Cork City, we felt a responsibility to bring meaning to what was going on around us. This was our new home. We chose to live in the city centre. We felt that starting conversation on social media was a good way to start. The interaction has blown us away. Clearly, lots of people feel the same way about the city and want to bring about a change. As interest grew, we introduced another key device with the tried and tested walk and talk. Basically, if anyone was interested in meeting with us, we invited them to join us in a walk and talk where together we'd share, reflect and explore our beautiful city. This has resulted in meeting a wonderful diverse mix of people who've really inspired and informed us through their professional expertise and knowledge of the city. We've met with sports coaches, philosophers, architects, DJs, filmmakers, artists, urban designers, to name just a few. Every conversation has revealed new and valuable insights. Now, everything we do with a niche reflects our urban rest play work model. What this means in practice is we believe everyone should have a place they can call home, a space where they can have fun and create, and access to fair, just, meaningful employment. We believe all urban environments should be livable, creative and productive. We believe they should be seen as social spaces with a focus on experience and not just spaces to consume. We want urban spaces to be co-designed with the people, for the people, with all resource use maximised for the benefit of everyone. We love to creatively reimagine the world around us, always placing people, their well-being, sense of place and prosperity at the centre, along with a transparent and functioning social contract. We decided to treat our new home as our largest immersion to date. And this is a collage of over 150 derelict properties that should be someone's home in the city centre.
So when we started sharing these images of dereliction over 11 months ago, we began to receive messages of all the reasons why dereliction exists and all the reasons why it's impossible to remove it. So one surprising reason that came up quite early was that building regulations were a barrier. Now for us, this was instantly quite worrying because we'd just bought a 200-year-old property in Amsterdam or in Cork that needed a huge deep retrofit. So actually our house needs very similar work to a lot of these homes. It needs new roof, new subfloor, new heating, new windows, new electrics, new plumbing, pretty much the whole shebang. But luckily there's some great guidance there provided by the Department of Housing on bringing back homes into use. And for us, this really helped demystify the need to meet new building regs when renovating old homes. So if building regs weren't a barrier that we thought they were, and we also know from our own experiences that costs aren't a huge barrier either, especially when comparing renovations to buying a turnkey or new build. It made us ask if all these other excuses we heard were any of them myths as well. So this is where I got my geek on. So this is my massive Excel file that I went through all the properties on Frank's Thread, and I looked for all the publicly available information for each of the properties, everything from its location, its heritage importance, its planning history, its sales records, and its registration. So from bringing all this data together, we were able to debunk 10 myths of dereliction. Now, I won't go through them all now because that will take way too long. But what I will do is I'll add a link to the full report in the chat room later. So with hearing all the reasons why dereliction is unsolvable, the biggest question we asked at the start was, is new legislation needed? And now the answer is a good Irish style. It is and it isn't. The Dereliction Act isn't perfect, but it's all we've got right now. And the thing is, it's not been fully enforced. So that means everywhere in Ireland, there are quick wins for dereliction, quick wins for our housing crisis and for our local businesses. Now we know that the Derelict Act alone won't be enough to end dereliction, and it does require new harmony legislations, especially something like a compulsory sales order. Yet there are lessons we can learn from the challenges of the Derelict Act and the areas that need to be strengthened and the additional support that local authorities need, especially resources to cover legal costs. Now you can certainly see here the need for a compulsory sales order. So take the fact that only 9% of the properties on Frank's Tread have been sold since 2013. That's a staggering low number. I do believe if all the houses, especially the houses, were sold at the right price and with the right support given to new homeowners, there would be thousands and thousands and thousands of people willing to buy, renovate and live in old houses in our towns and in our city centres. The biggest shock to us that came out of the data of dereliction was the threat dereliction poses to our built heritage. I still can't get my head around the fact that 47% of the properties on Frank's Tread are in architectural conservation areas, and there's not much evidence of conservation. Again, I'd like to point out this is not unique to Cork City. It's repeated all across Ireland. Our villages, our towns, and our cities are all losing their visual identity. Of course, we should be changing our cities and our towns, but we need to add to a city's identity, not remove it altogether. So these derelict properties here are actually all protected structures. Now, foolishly, I thought initially that protected status was meant to save a building, to save it from loss of its unique character. So I still can't understand why these buildings have been let get into such a bad state. Now, in all this dereliction and vacancy, there is a massive opportunity. All these buildings here, these are all owned by institutions that receive large public funding. Now, if all of these were either used for meanwhile use or to provide common good services, it would bring so many benefits to our towns and cities. Now, some of these buildings do have historic and open planning applications on them, but those plans can and do take decades to realise. But there is some good news. Cork City Council is opening up one of its derelict sites to become a meanwhile park this summer, and it will be called a test site. We're really looking forward to experiencing it. So once again, I'd like to say that Cork is not unique in its dereliction challenge, not just in Ireland, but also across Europe. Amsterdam was once a derelict city. It was a city that suffered suburban flight during the 70s and 80s. It lost 15% of its population. It was a city that had a massive drug problem, huge social unrest, large homeless problem, and a large land speculation problem. Now Amsterdam is a victim of its own excess. It again has a housing crisis, but this time because it's so attractive to families and tourists. And it's attractive because it's livable while also retaining its built heritage. Now, Amsterdam no longer has dereliction. Amsterdam no longer has a long-term vacancy problem. And Amsterdam would bite our hands off if we could get access to so much unused spaces.
So what we're looking to do obviously as well is look at opportunities, and it's very much about getting everyone to rest, play and work in the city. And what we're looking at is taking spaces that whether they're council owned, looking at opportunities for home, for play, for work, and likewise looking more deeply in terms of play, in terms of COVID, particularly this has highlighted the need for more parks, play space in the city. So that's a quick run through about what we've been at in Cork over the last number of years. I mean, thanks to everyone for listening and for everyone who's interacted with us too over the last number of years as well. If you want to join the conversation, we'd love you to hear your story, join us on social media, and likewise, if you're in Cork City, come along and join with us for a walk and talk. Thank you again for listening.
Thank you.
Great, guys. Thank you very much for that. Some amazing stories. And your Twitter feed, wow, it really gives us an idea of the work you put into it. So fair play to you and well done for that. There's a couple of questions in there. So we have one question which is from Ronan here. So basically what Ronan's point is that he believes very much in urban community-led housing, and he believes that this is a solution to the housing crisis. But his question is, why do you think the media and commentators are not discussing it enough? And you've had a lot of presence in the media recently, you know, in the Examiner piece and other articles. So why do you feel that the media may not be covering it enough?
I think I suppose in some senses, we're still new to Ireland, because although we came back, we're both Irish, and we came back in 2008, late 2018. Because we've been away for so long, we're still getting to know how things work here. Obviously, we had to deep dive into things like dereliction and into other legislation issues. But then on that cultural level as well, I suppose that's for us where some of the bigger shocks were on culturally, not only the dereliction side, but also things like community-led housing, why that hasn't been pushed forward, why there isn't more examples in Ireland of that being pushed.
But I suppose we're possibly a bit surprised, particularly when we looked at the city, in such a small part of the city, but in 2 kilometres of city centre Ireland, to see that trend is running for a year. It could also run for another year potentially, and so there is so many opportunities, and we are a bit surprised that it's not being picked up a bit more. Yeah. But like I said, we are trying to get our head around the culture around property, and also there's a lot of discussion that's too expensive and stuff. So there's
definitely a lot of myths around the cost aspect. But in terms, I suppose, overall, what we find in the media is that profit-driven aspect of property is pushed over and over again. And especially when cost rental then is seen as having to have profit as well, then it really throws your mind up.
And I suppose one thing we observe too, which is just a quick one, is that we've kind of observed that people are less inclined to move to city centres in Ireland. Whereas if you're abroad, you want to live in the city centre. Where we were surprised people were kind of moving out rather than moving in. And that's because a lot of cities in Ireland, unfortunately, aren't livable. They're not designed well enough for families and stuff, you know.
Yeah, very much. And I think that's really in relation to the 20-minute city concept. It's very much kind of what you're talking about, which is hugely topical at the moment. And just actually another question there from Sinead Perry, which is following on from a point you made there. Reference no profit in dereliction. How was it established that this is a myth? So, you know, market value less full cost to renovate. So it's really...
Yes. So on the profit, that's probably a wording issue. What we meant is that there's profit for just sitting and speculating. So if you just sit and speculate, I'll share the example of the full report, and you can see the few houses that we have shown from looking at what they were valued at when they were put on the derelict list, then looking at the price they sold for a few years later. There was massive profit made in between those 2 periods of time. So anything up to 20 grand a year just by sitting on a property alone.
Yeah, so again, we're trying to understand what it means if you leave a site derelict or property derelict for long term, what that means in terms of value and stuff. And I suppose the fact that sites have been left long term, we want to understand.
Yeah, we know from our own house here as well. So we bought an old property in Amsterdam, or in Cork, I keep saying Amsterdam, that needs a huge renovation. As you said, it needs everything done to it. We still also may need to replace some joists in the floors as well at some stage. But we know the cost of that, the cost of buying the house and cost of doing all the renovations will at least match buying any of the other houses that you can move into that don't need the same amount of work in our neighbours' area, say. But it's half the price of what an affordable house would be considered in the city.
Absolutely, yeah. And just following on from that, Michelle Ferguson just wants to know, are you engaging with any kind of politicians? Have you kind of gotten to that stage yet, or is this just, this has very much kind of been a passion, but is it going in any direction, do you think?
Yeah, I suppose we work internationally. We were very experienced at dealing with policymakers and working with international governments on the policy side. When we came back, I suppose this much is very much our work doing it. I suppose we wanted to kind of do it our way as such. So we've had some conversations.
It's all self-funded.
Self-funded.
Done in our own time.
Yeah, we wanted to kind of keep that independence and I suppose really just shine the light and show what's possible. But yeah, I mean, in terms of moving forward, we haven't really decided how we want to take it forward.
I mean, what we have done is we went and actually physically sat in council meetings and to understand how that local authorities work. And we've been watching a lot of them online since they've gone online as well. So we have, I suppose, done a lot of work to try and understand what those processes is and where the decision making lies as well.
Yeah, and I suppose so far we've made decisions so far not to be funded by anyone, so to self-funded, so we can kind of retain that, I suppose, fresh, independent insight, and I think that's been particularly beneficial to us. You know that we're kind of doing it, and we're doing it because we live here and we love the city, and we want the city to benefit for everyone really. And I suppose we see this immense potential in Cork City and right across Ireland to transform. You know, I think that's the thing. you know.
Absolutely, Frank. And I, as a fellow Cork person living in Cork, I couldn't agree more with you. But I've been told to wrap up, unfortunately. So I see there's a good number of questions coming in there for Jude and Frank. So again, folks, we will try and pass on these questions and hopefully we can get them back in some process to everyone. But please do keep the questions coming in. It is great to see. So I'm going to move on. Thank you very much, Jude and Frank. Firstly, thank you. Brilliant. So moving on to our second speaker from Ireland, Finn Keys. So Finn is a practicing barrister working in a number of different areas, including criminal law and judicial review. Finn teaches at Trinity College Dublin and has published widely in constitutional law, including particularly on the subject of constitutional property rights. He was formerly a legal researcher in the House of Oireachtas and Law Reform Commission. Finn is going to discuss his experiences with laws surrounding the property and, more importantly, the barriers that may be associated with them. Thank you, Finn.
Thanks very much, David. I appreciate that very much. That very kind introduction. So just bear with me one moment while I get my my PowerPoint presentation up here. So I'll just play this. Very good. Okay, so thanks very much, everyone. So my contribution is going to be talking about property rights and the Constitution. So briefly, where I'm coming at this from is that I've written and researched quite a bit about the influence of property rights on solutions to the housing crisis, and particularly how legislative reforms, etc., have been restricted or shot down on the basis of property rights concerns. In this presentation, I'll talk about property rights in a kind of general perspective, how they've been interpreted in the courts versus how they've been interpreted in the Oireachtas and in government circles, and then finally suggest a few things that we might want to think about in relation to constitutional property rights when it comes to compulsory sales orders. So first of all, the jumping off point for any consideration of constitutional property rights has obviously ought to be the text of the Constitution itself. So the Constitution protects constitutional property rights in two separate articles, which is somewhat unusual. So it's protected in Article 40.3 and Article 43 of the Constitution. So Article 40.3 is a general prescription for the defence of personal rights, and it provides that it particularizes certain personal rights to be defended, including protecting from unjust attack the property rights of every citizen. And then on the other side, Article 43, you can see from the outset saying that the state acknowledges that man, by virtue of his rational being, has the natural right to the extent antecedent to all positive law to the private ownership of external goods. So Article 43 is often seen as more as protecting the institution of private property from sort of general outright abolition. And this reflects the origins of the Constitution. So and particularly the Catholic emphasis on resisting communism in the 1930s, when the Constitution was drafted. The Constitution, of course, finalized in 1937, and also reflects the experience of the dispossessed Irish in the land war. So while the right is very firmly entrenched in the Constitution, it is very far from absolute, as it can be seen from the text itself. In particular, the text of Article 43 provides that the right ought in civil society to be regulated by the principles of social justice and should be reconciled with the exigencies of the common good. And similarly, it must constitute some sort of unjust attack on the right. So what we have to consider now is how have the courts interpreted this? Is a balancing act to be performed as between the private property rights themselves and the interests of the community on the other. So the kind of overarching lens through which the courts will determine this, and increasingly in recent times, is the proportionality test or the proportionality analysis. So proportionality was first applied in the property rights context by the Supreme Court in a case involving the Planning and Development Bill 1999, which became the Planning and Development Act of 2000, where people will be aware Part 5 of that. At the time was a bill proposed to provide that developers had to cede 20% of land in order for it to be made available for affordable housing. And the test that the court applied was that in determining whether the legislative provision interferes with the constitutional right in furtherance of collective good, the right must A, be rationally connected to the objective and not be arbitrary, unfair, or based on irrational considerations. Secondly, it must impair the right as little as possible. And thirdly, be such that its effects on the right are proportional to the object. So to break this down a little bit, the first test is sort of a rationality criterion. So it mustn't be arbitrary. There must be a reasoned, sensible basis for this, usually based on some sort of common good or social objective. The second is that it impair the right as little as possible. That is, is there another way the state can do this without restricting property rights to the same degree? If so, the state should do that. And then finally, is a sort of general balancing test that the courts can perform. So that's sort of overarching sort of prism through which the courts look at it. But there's also a line of case law where the courts have said that the state cannot essentially deprive the property rights of one group of society and give it to another, essentially. It's the state that must do the balancing, and it can't take from one to give to the other. And this was seen in these two cases, but I'll talk particularly about Article 26 in the Employment Equality Bill, where the Supreme Court struck down or declared to be unconstitutional in advance the Employment Equality Bill, which proposed to impose on employers the cost of retrofitting their workplaces to better allow for disabled persons to use and to be employed in those workplaces. And the court said that that imposed the burden of achieving social good on a particular subset of society. These cases have been cited often in response to an objection to housing reform, and they are sort of difficult precedent in that regard. However, the logic of the cases is slightly questionable and has been questioned on many times. For instance, if you take to its logical conclusion, it would essentially obviate all progressive legislation in terms of progressive taxation, taking from a richer group to go to a poorer group, etc. So there's open criticism on that ground. But also, it's just more important to consider that despite these cases, in far more occasions, the courts have upheld restrictions on property rights as legitimate than condemned them as invalid. And indeed, invasions on constitutional property rights are an everyday occurrence. It's commonplace, whether it be in terms of taxation, restrictions on trading hours, restrictions on you have to have a license in order to engage in particular business activity. The list goes on. They're an everyday part of ordinary life. And the courts have particularly said that constitutional property rights, that there should be a deference given to the Oireachtas in its determination of where the balance lies as between property rights and the common good in the times of crisis. So this was seen in particular in a few cases during the financial crisis, and the court said that the court would have regard to the crisis in the state in terms of interpreting the Constitution, and particularly in this case that I've referenced in the slide here, J&J Hare and Minister for Health. The court says, you can see the quote at the bottom there, it says, these economic realities must inform the interpretation of the Constitution of phrases in assessing what the state can do. So it's to be remembered that the Constitution is written in the present tense, and it applies to the circumstances that apply at the moment. And therefore, the current crises and current challenges must inform the interpretation of the Constitution, including in relation to property rights. So briefly, while as I've written and I've argued, the scope that the Constitution allows the Oireachtas to limit property rights in further of the common good is, I say, is very wide. Property rights have been used to resist lots of housing reforms in the Oireachtas, and some research I did suggests that between 2009 and 2019, at least 13 bills designed to tackle the housing crisis were rejected by the government, citing constitutional concerns and usually based on the advice of the Attorney General. So the advice of the Attorney General has been often referred to as becoming increasingly controversial. The difficulty is that the Attorney General is the legal advisor to the government, and the government will tend to bring questions to the Attorney General about whether a law is or isn't constitutional. And if the advice of the Attorney General is that it is not, then the government tends not to proceed with it. That is not controversial in and of itself, but the difficulty is that this is happening more and more. And it's difficult to probe the Attorney General's advice, because the Attorney General advice is almost never published. And therefore, it's very difficult to criticize or question it and to probe its accuracy. And indeed, the extent of the AG's influence in this regard has led to him being described as a one-man Supreme Court. So moving towards the end of my presentation now. So compulsory sales orders are sort of a flip side of a compulsory purchase order. Again, I don't want to talk, I'm not an expert on the policy aspects of compulsory sales orders. I'm going to try and stick to the law as much as possible here. But so it's first of all to consider CPOs, so compulsory purchase orders, are, as I'm sure many of you are well aware, are well established to local authorities to act in the common interest. There's a huge number of them in legislation involving a wide array of different measures, but some notable examples are the Housing Act 1966 and, as has been discussed, the Derelict Sites Act of 1990. However, compulsory purchase orders are a serious interference with private property rights and in almost every case require compensation at what's called open market value. So this brings us to finally the question of compulsory sales orders themselves. So firstly, this is just some sort of general direction of what we might think about. It's not legal advice, so just to flag that. But what I would suggest is that I say there's little to suggest that CSOs would infringe the Constitution per se. If compulsory purchase orders are constitutional, it is likely that compulsory sales orders are. However, it has to be remembered that the expropriation of property, the entire removal of it, as opposed to just restrictions on it, is a significant interference with private property rights, and you'd have to design the legislation quite carefully in order to prevent a constitutional challenge. So some of the issues to be considered are, so firstly, we might want to consider whether when there's a compulsory sales order and then there's an auction on foot of that compulsory order, whether there should be some sort of reserve price at the auction. The reason for this is that there's a very large body of case law in relation to CPOs saying that the compensation, it must be at open market value, at least in almost all cases, not necessarily every case, but in almost all cases. And if there were, if someone was able to, if there was a CSO created a particular market in which a property could be bought for much less than market value, that could be constitutionally problematic. And secondly, fair procedures. So it would be important to have a right to object, potentially a right to an oral hearing as to whether your property should be subject to a CSO, and also potentially a right of appeal to on board Planala or another body. But that would all have to be hammered out in the detail. So that is most of what I wanted to say. It was a very whistle-stop tour of constitutional property rights. There's much more to it than that, but I hope it's been a little bit useful for you all, and I'd welcome any questions that anyone might have.
Thanks, Ben. I think that's great, and I think what's really interesting, your last slide there, your 2 points that you've highlighted, what we're going to see later on with Professor David Adams and just our Scottish speaker is just some of the solutions to those, I think, and just the model that they have proposed, which is incredibly interesting. So thank you for that. And again, I find it just so interesting, 13 bills rejected when we're trying to do housing reform, and that it is such a difficult topic for Ireland to get reforms. So we've got a couple of questions just coming in late there. So I have one question. This is from Dunnan Harvey. What rights do the owners of the neighbouring houses beside derelict sites have, especially when derelict starts affecting their property? Might be some free legal advice here for Finn.
I mean, that's not tricky. I mean, it could amount to a nuisance if you're going to get into short law. So you could seek to sue them on that basis. But again, I mean, that's very fact specific. It would depend very much on the individual circumstances. I think you would be writing to your local authority in that instance and notifying them of the derelict sites. The local authority is required under the Derelict Sites Act to keep a register of all derelict sites and then to act on that as appropriate, but either by a levy or by a CPO at some point. Yeah. There's a couple more quick questions here. So Philip, I see your question there, but I'm going to come back to you, Philip, now. It's just extremely long, so I'm afraid what we will do is forward that on to Finn. Anthony Harper has a good question there. Actually, it's close to my heart because I had a shop on North Main Street in Cork once. So is it possible that a CSO could be issued as a public health and safety measure? So, for example, there was a collapsed building in North Main Street in Cork. It's possible. I don't know if any compulsory purchase orders or powers for CPOs have been implemented under the recent legislation. I mean, there's a huge number of different CPO powers across a very wide array of legislation. So it's possible there's one somewhere in relation to that. There certainly has been one under the most recent public health legislation, but it's possible, but I just don't know. There's a huge body of legislation on that, but I don't know for sure.
Yeah, and again, there's a lot of people, Colin, especially saying that obviously for any kind of CSO, and I think this is an important message for part of this webinar, that for us to have CSO here, it would need legislation, which is the most important thing.
Yeah, certainly. I mean, you can't. I don't think it could be. You can't. It would be very difficult to restrict property rights in that way without primary legislation. And particularly in the development of primary legislation, you have a very extended policy process, a consultation, and it allows you to design and draw legislation, including in consult with the Office of the Parliamentary Draftsman, that you get a very balanced piece of legislation that is most likely to survive any possible challenge that it might face.
Okay, and hopefully we might get to, oh, Brian, we're finished there. Sorry, Philip, I just missed out on your question there, but again, folks, thank you for all the questions. Do keep coming in, and we will basically put all Finn's aside and we will get them to Finn after the event and hopefully get them back to you. Finn, thank you very much for that. Really interesting, some really interesting points there on a lot of the bills that are being rejected and the Attorney General story. I think that's incredibly interesting. So thank you for your contribution, much appreciated.
Thank you very much.
Okay, so we are now going to move on to our Scottish representatives. So our first speaker from Scotland is Professor David Adams, who is former Land Commissioner at the Scottish Land Commission and Emeritus Professor in Urban Studies. So Professor Adams has published widely on urban land problems and is particularly interested in resolving ownership constraints to urban development and tackling land vacancy and dereliction. Professor David Adams will discuss his experiences of CSO in Scotland and what they are trying to achieve to tackle the crisis of vacancy and dereliction in Scottish towns. Thank you, David. Over to you.
Thanks, David. I'm very pleased indeed to be part of this webinar. I'm just going to share my screen with my presentation. Okay. So what I want to do in 10 minutes is to explain where we are now in Scotland with compulsory sale orders and what is likely to happen over the next few years. And I will give some background to that. The first body that recommended the introduction of compulsory sale orders was an independent advisory group set up by the Scottish Government to look across land reform as a whole. It was a very wide-ranging 200-page report, but it did include the specific recommendation to introduce compulsory sale orders. And after some discussion in the Parliament, there was a commitment from the government to legislate. That commitment was to be delayed by Brexit and all the secondary legislation required for that. But subsequent to that commitment, the Scottish Land Commission, which is a public body, an independent advisory body to the government, produced a very detailed proposal. And at the recent Scottish elections, 3 of the parties, including the SNP, who have reformed the government, have committed themselves to introduce legislation. Well, why do we need reform? It's interesting to hear about your derelict survey in Ireland. Scotland has a vacant and derelict land survey that goes back to 1993. And for a very long time, there's been about 11,000 hectares of vacant and derelict land. And of those 11,000 hectares, roughly 47% have been in exactly the same condition for at least 20 years. So we have hardcore vacancy that is not changing. Now, obviously, there's inflows and outflows each year, but the overall stock is there. So the inflows and outflows generally balance each other. And alongside the vacant and derelict land, there's now about 40,000 long-term empty private sector homes in Scotland. And I just want to give sort of 1 or 2 pictures from my work in North Glasgow of sort of what are we looking at. So you can see this kind of building. It's been in that condition for a very, very long time. Buildings as well. And the real issue that has been identified is the balance between the public interest and private interests. And the view has gradually been emerging that there comes a time, however long that is considered to be, when the public interest must override the private interest, when individual owners should no longer be allowed to retain landed property without sale or use. And in those circumstances, planning authorities, if the legislation goes through, would be given the power to trigger compulsory sale orders, and that would require the site to be sold by public auction or unconditional tender. I should just say, picking up what Finn said in the last session, there's no commitment whatsoever for a reserve price or open market value. And the reason for that is it's actually extremely difficult for these kind of properties to determine through valuation what the open market value is. So the Land Commission produced a very detailed report with a whole series of processes that could take up to 3 years to work through a compulsory sale order. But I want to identify and emphasize, first of all, that the purpose at the beginning is to encourage dialogue and negotiation with owners, to open up a line of communication and hopefully persuade the owners to do something without having to resort to a compulsory sale order. If that doesn't succeed, and if the authority wants formally to make a CSO, at a point in the process, there would be a formal appeal to an independent body against the authority's decision. And if in due course the whole thing is confirmed, then the site would be sold by public auction. Now, that work is part of a much wider programme of work by the Scottish Land Commission on reuse of vacant and derelict land. And you can see here a whole series of reports produced by the Scottish Land Commission, which have resulted in a commitment from the Scottish Government towards the end of last year to set up a £50 million fund over 5 years to energise the reuse of derelict sites in Scotland. And the first invitations to bid for those sites for that money has now been opened. Those of you who wish to follow those reports in detail, the Scottish Land Commission website, they are all available and public downloadable. But you'll have seen that they include reports on the impact of communities, so not just the next door neighbour, but the community as a whole on vacancy and dereliction, and actually trying to assess the economic benefits of reuse in a much broader way than many narrow valuation processes do. Now, alongside the compulsory sale orders, I should also perhaps mention Scotland's community rights to buy, introduced for the first time in 2003 in rural areas, giving community bodies, properly constituted community bodies, the right of preemption. And that was extended to urban areas in 2015. But alongside the extension to urban areas in 2015, the Act also introduced the possibility of compulsory community rights to buy for land that is abandoned, neglected, or in detrimental condition. I have to say there have been very few applications so far, and none have been approved. An additional compulsory community right to buy to further sustainable development came into being actually quite recently, and again, no applications. But watch this space to see if there are successful applications down that route, which would be an alternative in some senses to a compulsory sale order. So the next steps, the CSO legislation is expected to be introduced in the Scottish Parliament sometime over the next 5 years. And there's probably going to be a formal consultation before that. The intention, as I've intimated, is that it will be initially intended as a reserve power for local authorities to approach and negotiate with landowners. We do not have a formal written constitution, but actually much of what Finn says are similar considerations would come out in the courts in Scotland, especially in relation to the European Convention on Human Rights, which would be the key test. Hopefully we'll also see some successful applications soon under the compulsory community right to buy legislation. So I think what is going on in Scotland, and I've sort of just been able to touch on it because there's a lot more detail that you can access and a very interesting debate that I think is about to break through into public knowledge, is it's all part of redefining the relationship between property rights and public interest. And actually the Scottish Land Commission is doing this in a whole series of ways, including proposals to tackle concentrated rural land ownership. So there's a lot of land reform work going on in Scotland at the moment. And just perhaps a final thought on the proposal. This is a photograph I took of a vacant site in inner Glasgow. What's happening to it? It's actually being sold, or it was being sold and was sold at that date by auction. So what I think the proposal is doing conceptually is not necessarily an interference in market processes, although it could be conceived as that way. It can be argued that property markets are highly inefficient. That's why we end up with the amount of dereliction we have. They don't operate like other markets. And what we need to do is to have mechanisms to ensure that they work in an efficient way. And when they do work in an efficient way, then sites like this are put up for auction anyway. So I think it is arguable that a legislative measure is not there to necessarily overcome or interfere with the market. It's actually to ensure that market processes take place as perhaps economic theory says they should do, and that we don't end up with a huge overhang of vacant and derelict land. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, David. Thank you very much. And again, thank you for the links that David has mentioned there. We absolutely will post. I myself have read a number of the publications, and the actual final CSO proposal put forward to the Scottish Government is just, in my opinion, just a delightful read, and it is incredibly logical and it just makes sense. There's been a couple of questions come in there from Orla, Margarita, and Ivor, and they're not very specific to Scotland, so they're some of them are very good but related to previous speakers, so we will get back to them again after the event. Just David, can I ask you one question on, with regards to one thing you mentioned there, that your Community Rights to Buy Act, that there hasn't been huge take up on it, and there hasn't been, it hasn't been very impactful. Do you think that's something that we could learn here, prior to introducing something similar?
Well, once the legislation was passed, the primary legislation was passed some time ago, there was then 2 or 3 years whilst all the secondary legislation has gone through. So it's probably a couple of years since the first one became active, and probably a year ago since the second one became active. So it's probably too early to judge. Having said that, the processes are extremely complex for any community group to get their heads around. It's hard enough anyway for a local authority to undertake a compulsory purchase order. Asking a community group to do the equivalent, which is probably what it amounts to, is a big ask. So I think the issues and the debate going on in Scotland is, what support do community groups need? Technical support, professional support, financial support, to take on that challenge. And I think that's probably going to be at the forefront of the debate as we go forward.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I do think that there's a lot for us here in Ireland that we can learn from, previous legislations he put forward and things like that. And one other thing I found very interesting, which I think is very innovative, because an awful lot of the conversations over here regarding CSO is very much about local authorities responsible for the purchasing. But your CSO proposal puts forward that it's to the open market, so that a private person can buy it once the auction is triggered, but as long as it's repurposed for the benefit of the community.
Well, yes, indeed. But the process, I didn't have time to go into that, would the sale would be conditioned on making sure that something happened. In other words, you wouldn't allow someone to buy a derelict piece of land through a CSO and keep it derelict for years to come. So that's an important part. But the key point, as I intimated in the conversation, is in many of the locations that actually the market, if there is a market, is not one that is easy to judge. And the role of the local authority is to make sure that the sale process takes place in all due process. There is proper advertising, there is a proper period by which it's announced. And at that point, you could argue that the price and the process of auction is actually the market working in its most raw. So providing anyone who is able, knows about the availability, is able to come along and make a bid, whatever comes out of that process, you could say is a much better evidence of what is the appropriate price to be paid for the building or the land than, should we say, a set of chartered surveyors trying to form an estimate.
Yeah. Brilliant. That's fantastic, David. So interesting. And we definitely will post all the links that David has mentioned there, because some of them are incredibly interesting. And again, some of the generic questions that are popping in there, we will feed them to the right individuals and get back to you. Thank you, David. Very much appreciated. And we will move on. So we are now going to our second Scottish representative, Scott McKay, who is the Executive Director of the Mid-Steeple Quarter. Scott is also an experienced director-level business owner and planning consultant with McKay Planning. The Mid-Steeple Quarter's core vision was to shape a new future for their town centre, which responds to the community's needs and is run for their benefit. Scott will discuss the inspirational story, and it is inspirational, demonstrating a grassroots approach to tackling dereliction and restoring a town's vibrancy and vitality. Over to you, Scott.
Hello there. Hello, everybody. Thank you, David, for that lovely introduction. I'll just share my screen. So I'm based in Southwest Scotland. As David says, I'm a consultant town planner and executive director of Mid-Steeple Quarter in the town of Dumfries. Mid-Steeple Quarter is more than just a project. It's actually a community benefit society with the purpose of breathing new life into Dumfries town centre by redeveloping empty high street properties to create a new neighbourhood with a mix of uses built upon principles of local prosperity and well-being. For centuries, Dumfries has been the principal market town for the region of Dumfries and Galloway. However, despite its previous wealth and economic prosperity, in recent years it's become a market town with no market, like a coal town with no mine. This is Dumfries High Street in 2012. Many buildings are underused and in poor condition. The community is demoralised about the state of their town centre. The reasons: in the 1980s and 90s, Dumfries was judged to have a big enough catchment to justify establishing national chain stores. So property investors bought up the high street and rented to national chains, pricing out independent local shops and other businesses like hotels and bars. And our high street became a monoculture of retail. Planning policy exacerbated this with a priority for Class 1 retail in high streets, making it difficult for units to get change of use. The national chains were only interested in enlarging their footprint on the ground floors, and they extended the ground floors, and the businesses were not interested in the diversity of people living upstairs. Flats were emptied, and these upper floor spaces were either converted to storage or abandoned entirely. All the upper floors in this image are empty, resulting in a depopulated high street. The combination of these factors means that come 5 p.m, it becomes a ghost town. The Scottish Government's community empowerment and land reform legislation was really at the heart of the ideal for Mid-Steeple Quarter. Using initiatives like community asset transfers and community right to buy, we hope to bring 8 high street properties into community ownership and develop them as a community for the benefit of the community. Previously, this legislation has been used predominantly in the Highlands to buy back land from shooting estates or islands that were then stewarded by the community. And Dumfries was really the first to cry that we wanted to buy back our high street. Public engagement was key to building capacity and to take the idea forward, and there were many projects, including the Duntoon Army, where groups of volunteers who took part in street cleans and repainting closes and shop fronts. These calls to action brought more people and stakeholders into the conversation. Around this time, we got our first significant support from the local council. Enlightened officials in the housing department put forward an idea called the Town Centre Living Fund, which used the receipts from council tax on second homes to create a £1 million a year fund to support projects that encouraged people to live in town centres. A bid to the fund by the Stove Network, an artists-led community trust, resulted in an award of £100,000 to put together the necessary justification for a community asset transfer for the first target building of those 8 identified, and to set up, constitute and launch a community organisation to run the project, plus to continue the community engagement projects. Following in-depth research, a community benefit society was decided upon as the preferred organisational structure, as this would allow us to offer community shares and supported the principle of collective ownership afforded by a benefit society. It seemed to be the MSQ Community Benefit Society was launched in April 2018 with a public event in the town centre. A local politician spoke from soapboxes and about the importance of the town centre, and we had fire eaters and musicians. On that first day, more than 150 people signed up as members, and our current membership is now over 500. MSQ is run by a board that is annually elected by that membership. The board employ a small project team to run the project day to day. Members pay an initial £1 share in the project and receive a share certificate showing their part ownership of the project. Sharing these on social media has been a very successful way of widening membership and awareness of the project. We honed our vision for the High Street and produced our vision document called A Blueprint for the Heart of Dumfries. This glossy document expresses our mission in a way which enables us to better communicate it to the world, especially with stakeholders, partners and grant funders. And you can download this document from the resources page on our website. The focus was on a stretch of Dumfries High Street located in the centre of the town, adjacent to the historic Mid-Steeple building. This was the focus of the majority of vacant buildings and empty upper floors. Here, almost all the properties on the High Street have been empty and disused for some time. Many were significantly decayed as a result of neglect by absentee owners. We consider it to be the heart of the town centre, and this urban block has become defined as Mid-Steeple Quarter. We sought to reimagine this block of empty buildings as a community-run mixed development of live, work, education, enterprise and social spaces. Our idea is that the Mid-Steeple Quarter will bring new life to a concentrated area in the very centre of the town to stimulate new growth around it, encouraging investment and confidence back into the local economy. This master plan was submitted to the council and was adopted in November 2019 as supplementary planning policy, underpinned by planning policy in the Local Development Plan 2 for Dumfries and Galloway. The master plan was founded on 3 key principles: the local community taking the lead on redevelopment, repopulating the town centre by creating high quality but affordable housing on upper floors, and dynamic, engaging street level activity supporting a mixed and vibrant local economy. The economic strategy and development are central to the vision. By providing much needed quality micro enterprise space in the heart of the town, partnering with South of Scotland Enterprise, Dumfries and Galloway Council and the Stove Network to create jobs and a vibrant economy in the centre of the town. The completed regeneration envisages 60 homes on upper floors and around 50 units for other uses, mainly on ground floors. The master plan includes a phasing plan showing phase 1, the former baker's oven, phase 2, site assembly through purchase and meanwhile use of other high street frontages and backland, phase 3, redevelopment of high street frontages and backland, and phase 4 and 5 working with owners but not necessarily considering acquisition. Phase 1, the plans for phase 1 of the project are at an advanced stage of design and planning. It comprises a redevelopment of the former bakery shop at 135139 High Street, which faces onto one of the main squares on the High Street. The building was owned by Diffuse and Galloway Council, and Mid-Steeple Quarter took ownership of this building through a community asset transfer, which was agreed in November 2018. The upper floors are essentially derelict, but the ground floor of the building has been used by Mid-Steeple Quarter since then as a pop-up shop, exhibition and event space. The idea being that we could test the capacity of the market for community groups to make use of the space, which would assist in formulating our ideas for the future. Having successfully prototyped and tested the community use of the ground floor space, the community began to realise that this building and the land to the rear had great potential, so plans were drawn up for its development. The redevelopment plans include the building, its entire plot, and a former studio building to the rear. The existing High Street building is to be retained, with a 7-storey extension at the rear. The plans will seek to activate the close which links the High Street to Irish Street to the rear. We aim to achieve change and build a track record as soon as possible. Therefore, this phase 1 is important in order that we can prove our concept for the rest of the Mid-Steeple vision to take shape. The proposals provide for a range of flexible businesses, cultural and community spaces on the ground and first floors, with 7 affordable flats to rent on upper floors. Feasibility work has taken development proposals through architectural design, community engagement and business planning in discussion with the council and other public agencies. A detailed planning permission for this was granted in August 2020. Demolition site preparation started in March this year, with a completion date in mid-2023. In the meantime, phase 2 is already well underway with the acquisition of additional buildings. Earlier this year, we identified and approached all the owners of buildings along the High Street of Mid-Steeple Quarter. A mixed picture of potential acquisitions emerged, and to date, we've been in negotiation with the owners of 5 more buildings where the owners have indicated they might sell. During this period, we also involved ourselves in discussions with funders, including the Scottish Land Fund and South of Scotland Enterprise Agency. We finalised the purchase of 2 buildings in September 2020, and following a recent crowdfunder campaign in January, we bought 2 more buildings in March this year. With the exception of the first building, which was acquired through asset transfer from the local council, all the other acquisitions have been acquired through negotiation and private sale at or below independent market value, with the threat of the community right to buy in the background. We are progressing community right to buy on 1 building where the owner is holding out for a price higher than independent market valuation. That building is empty, but with a lease in place for another 5 years to run, and the owner is happy to let it sit empty and take the rent before selling to us at the end of the lease. These are examples of 2 acquisitions. Both of these buildings have been vacant for over 10 years and are sadly suffering from lack of maintenance during that period. Both the buildings are currently undergoing temporary repairs inside and out to make them ground floors suitable for meanwhile uses while we prepare the redevelopment plans. In order to identify these buildings, we carried out an online poll with our membership, following which we renamed the buildings the Smithy and the Press, both names evocative of the past lives of these interesting buildings. MSQ are working with local people and businesses to use these buildings on a short-term rent basis and to work with us to come up with new community enterprise ideas. The taking forward of the Mid-Steeple Quarter vision would not be possible without the ongoing support and collaboration with our stakeholders and partners, who provide expertise, capacity, and of course funding. Through our experience, we are now influencing legislation and policy at national and local levels. MSQ has matured, having moved from a campaign group with a mission to become a community property development organisation. And although we now are a dedicated and growing project team, MSQ is always and will be driven by the power of our members and volunteers. What we're doing is pioneering, and we remain determined to keep that spirit of protest and passion for positive change which has got us this far. Engagement and communications are very important to the success of MSQ, and we have an extensive community engagement, social media and communications programme. You can download resources from our website and follow our social media channels. We've created the hashtag Reclaim the High Street to reflect the community taking back control, and anyone can join as a member and be part of our journey wherever you live.
Fantastic,
you.
Scott, and congratulations on reducing it down. You did so well. I've seen Scott's presentations before, and it was a challenge for him to get it down. So well done. Some great questions coming in, so I'm going to get straight into them. We have two questions, one from James Chilton and one from Dunn & Harvey, and they're very similar in content. So I'm just going to say it's very much essentially what would you suggest for community groups here in Ireland that are tackling the issue of dereliction from a community perspective? What would be your gracious piece of advice?
Community engagement and capacity building. Yeah, to be able to actually create an organisation which has the capacity to do this is the hardest thing, and that took many years. So although the Mid-Steeple Quarter was constituted in April 2018, there was about 4 years of engagement kind of work that built up over the preceding years to get us to that stage.
Wow, yeah. But it's passion, you know. Yeah. Even speaking to some of your colleagues, that's one thing that's always kind of shined through. Kelly Cotell has a question there. How does the community asset transfer work?
Essentially, it was in simple terms, it was an agreement between the local authority, the council, and us, and that they had to be convinced that we had the capacity to take the building on and that we would use it productively on behalf of the community. And that took, from start to finish, that took 2 years for the council to agree to that and sign off on that transfer. And we had to have a business plan in place before that could happen.
Yeah, which is a great example of public-private partnerships. And again, our next speaker will be talking a little bit about that. One other question from Francis Cody. How many of the buildings are protected under legislation?
I'm assuming maybe you mean heritage protection,
yeah.
like listed buildings. Most of them are. Well, we're in a conservation area, and apart from the phase 1 building, which was the asset transfer, which we are redeveloping, the rest of them are all listed, either category C or category B listed buildings.
Okay, great. Anthony Harper has a question. How useful was the tax on holiday homes for the Mid-Steeple Quarter project?
Well, that was fundamental to starting us off. That £100,000 was the sort of seed that started the whole project becoming a reality, and enabled us to actually start acquiring properties. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, great. Question from Philip Crow. Scott, can you explain how the Development Trust Association Scotland supports your work? Is there a connection between a community benefit society and a community development trust in Scotland?
They are different things. The Community Benefit Society is really the best comparison. It's kind of more like a traditional building society. So the community, individuals can buy individuals or businesses can buy shares in the Community Benefit Society. A development trust is a membership organisation that reflects the community, but it doesn't have that share element to it. Okay.
Very good. I've been told my 50 minutes. I've just one more question I'm going to get, because I think it's a good question. How could 4 years be reduced? I suppose, what mistakes should we avoid? I think that's a good one.
I think things have moved on significantly since that time. So that period in leading up to 2018, legislation's moved in. But more than that, I suppose it's just the will at political level now has changed significantly. And is moving forward all the time, and this is what we're finding. The conversations that we are having with government in Scotland is that the doors are opening more easily than they did sort of previous to 2018. Yeah. Okay, perfect. Well, listen, Scott, thank you very much. And with all the speakers, unfortunately, I know we're under time limits, but we could sit here and chat for ages, but unfortunately I have to move on. But thank you very much. Brilliant presentation. Okay, so we are moving on to our fifth speaker of the day, fifth and final speaker of the day, Usa Nagar. And Usa has worked extensively in municipalities and was previously mayor of Augustenborg in southern Denmark. Usa is currently chairwoman of the Technical and Environmental Committee for Sonderborg's municipality, which consists of 7 towns in southern Denmark. Usa brings a
public-private partnership perspective of tackling vacant buildings in Denmark, and believes it is all about collaboration and getting the community involved. And I'm delighted to have her here today to speak with us. So over to you, Usa.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can indeed.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much to you, David and Brian, to ask me to just be a little bit with all this. I think this was quite interesting what I have been listening to until now. And bear with me, because I'm not English or Irish or Scottish. I'm Danish. But normally we learn English in school, but not just as good as you. It's true what you said, that I'm right now the chairman of the Technical and Environmental Committee in Sonderborg. And Sonderborg is municipal with 75,000 inhabitants. And it's true, we used to be 7 municipalities. In 2007, we made this amalgamation, as we call it. And at that time, I was mayor in Augustenborg. And before that, again, I was in a private company having to do also with the car manufacturers in England. So that was quite funny. But I always have been, as a politician, been engaged in involving citizens, because I'm sure that the 31 members of the city council in Sonderborg cannot do everything. We're not just as good in everything. We need all the other people. And that was from Augustenborg, my general opinion. And super in Augustenborg, I could get the people with me about really doing a kind of special process. In 2003, at a January cold Sunday, we had employed, you could say, or engaged a special city expert in buildings, in structure, in everything. And we agreed with him to walk around with the citizens in the town, and he should be just tell us everything about the houses he saw. Even though the owners went with us, I said, we are direct here. We say as it is, because we needed to educate people to think otherwise. You should know that Sonderborg is only half an hour from the German border. And until 1920, we were German here. And this city where I live in Augustenborg, the former municipality, it was originally governed by a duke, a German duke. And of course, you can see at all the buildings that is different. And in Augustenborg, every house nearly, in special streets, they are protected. So you cannot do what you would like to do. At that time, in 2003, I invited the citizens who would like to go with us on a bus trip to 3 other cities in southern part of Jutland and Fyn, the island Fyn. And I would like to show how should it be and how should it not be, because that's the only way to really get education into people, by showing practical things. And after that, we established 6 groups of citizens who work with different subjects, themes in that story. And in the end, we approved in the city council in Augustenborg. And that really was the result, a conservation local plan in the historical city we got here, which we, of course, still have here. And I think either you, Brian, or David should now play this small video, and I simply just continue to talk. Because the outcome in 2016, I got this house from a landlord. He gave us this building, Hofrådens hus, you call it in Danish. This means the Duke's superintendent house, I think, from 1774. The building is right now, and since that 2016, being renovated by a civil society organization. Every Monday, 15 people, retired carpenters or whatever they have learned or have been educated, they go on doing all this work for free. And it's so in Denmark that changes of all protected buildings must be proved by the palaces and culture agency. We cannot just do what we want to do. So that is why we are able to really do this as a civil society project, and people really love it. And now they can see that we really get a good result from it. The landlord who gave me that building, I said to him, listen, Torben, if you want to be mentioned as the one who gave us this building, it did not look that good. You could see on the earlier pictures. He said, no, Åsa, I would just want you to do what you would like to do. And that's how we, with the municipality also, because I also managed to apply for some money to this house, because of course civil societies have no money. So we need also to make sure that we can go on further and further. And then in Denmark, we also apply for different big funds who would like to really do this in this historical city. And so if you would like to go in and see how this goes on, you can also, I think I have provided you with a different homepage, and you can go in and look into what is it. Of course, you need to have that translated, but I would also say I give my mail and my mobile phone number. If you ever like to talk to me about anything, just let me know. Or in the end, come and visit us. Come and visit us. Now we can travel again, can't we?
Well, you know I'm on the list for that, Åsa, so we're definitely going to visit for sure.
But that's a little story here.
Yeah, and I think what Åsa, your message is very much collaboration and the public-private partnership, that you were coming from the municipality and you were engaging with the citizens and bringing them forward. And this was a result of it, that people just wanted to do it because you were all working together.
Yeah, and David, you can say, if I take the 31 politicians in Sønderborg City Council or municipality, not everyone would like to do this. You should have the feeling that it really works, that there is a good result of it, or that you would like to really keep that house as it was.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think this is where the balance of Scott's story, that we have, you can have legislation, which you don't. You have legislation for smaller villages, but for bigger towns and cities, that it has to be done from a grassroots passion, working together point of view. And you're another example of how you can do that without legislation as such.
Yes.
Yeah. Brilliant story, Åsa. Well, listen, that is the end of our webinar, folks. And I would definitely, we would really like to take this opportunity to thank all of our speakers for giving up their valuable time, not only for today, but in the past couple of weeks. There has been a good bit of preparation involved in the event, and they've all been incredibly generous with their time. I'd also like to thank everybody who's attended. Thank you for your questions, your contributions. We are going to definitely go through all those. And just also to note, once you log off, there is going to be a quick pop-up survey of 2 questions, very simple. We would love you to take the time to fill it out. Should only take you 60 seconds to do. But again, it's just something we'd love to get feedback from you. And on that final note, I will finally hand you over to Ali. And again, thank you to Ali for having myself and Brian as parts of the day. Thoroughly enjoyed it. So back over to you, Ali, with final comments.
Thanks so much. That was absolutely so impressive. I learned so much, and I'm just sort of dying to talk to everybody again. So it's a pity we have to finish up, but I just want to sort of, distill what we've been talking about today. So I suppose really Jude and Frank, they talked about the sort of grassroots, how important it is to raise awareness, how to get out there, take the photographs. The 150 derelict properties, really powerful image. I mean, I've been following your stuff on Twitter. I think that's how we met originally last year. So yeah, I mean, it's really, we have to harness the grassroots. And then with Finn, obviously, we need to know the legal background. We need to know what is possible within our constitution. And also we need to look at sort of, the ability to look at negotiation. I mean, I think there's a whole lot of skills there. I think negotiation was mentioned quite a lot. So in terms of the key sort of takes for me, you know, we really need to look at what is the common good, what is public interest. As Finn said, you know, when does that actually kick in and become sort of more important? Negotiation can take a long time. Obviously, we need those skills, we need the structures to do that. Scott's stuff is just amazing. I mean, my whole background is community-led planning, so I absolutely love what he was talking about. I absolutely loved every speaker. I thought it was just so interesting. Capacity building is not easy, as everybody knows. So I mean, that takes time too. And again, we must have the structures and the leadership in place to do that. And political will has to be there fundamentally. I think that's come across really strongly, you know, that really is a benefit. I mean, we've been talking about this with the Scottish for quite a while, for a number of years now, you know, so we really do need that leadership, that political leadership. And I mean, obviously in Denmark, that leadership is there. So great to, you know, sort of pull that all together. So, I mean, it really, I suppose what we're going to have to focus on, it looks like we're going to have to do the macro and the micro, and we're going to have civic leadership, you know, sort of structures, and we're going to obviously have to tap into the political will and use our neighbours and you know, share and exchange with our neighbours in Denmark and Scotland, because obviously you guys have been doing great work. And we are trying to sort of, you know, push this agenda forward. And that's the whole purpose of today's webinar. And hopefully the questions that will come up, we will, you know, look at those as well to see how people can help. One of the key things that we've done now, everybody that is registered, we've asked people, can we set up a database so that we can actually, you know, again, go back to that sort of capacity building, see who's out there. Unless we have the information, we cannot get the change that we need. So thank you to all our speakers, and thank you to David and Brian. It's been such an enjoyable session, and so nice to talk to everybody in the last few weeks about what we were trying to do. I would imagine that this is the first of a series of webinars on this topic, because it's just so important. The vacancy rates in our towns are far too high, and we just need to get going, and we need to sort of try and remove those blockages as quickly as we can with your help. So thank you to our neighbours. Thank you very much, folks, and we will be in touch by email. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Thank you all. Thanks all for attending.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done, folks.